Greetings to everybody in my ancient civilization class. This is an experiment. I'm an old guy and I'm technically challenged. So we're going to see if we can make this work. And if it doesn't, we'll have to try something else. But for right now, I'm going to continue with my lectures about where we left off. What I'm discussing last time was the Roman Empire. Oh, by the way, I should mention that this is testable on the final examination. Everything that we've covered so far was also tested on the last exam. I hope you all had a very, very nice holiday, and we will now continue with the lecture part of this course. Some of this will be repetitive, so please bear with me. We were talking about some of the aspects of the Roman Empire, one of which is that after the Romans reached their logical limit geographically, which was largely on a line between the Rhine and Danube rivers, or along the Rhine and Danube rivers, the legions' function changed somewhat. They're not marching into foreign lands near as much to conquer. In fact, they are just simply protecting what Rome already has. The Romans created what we call the limes, or what they call the limes, which are border defenses. The most famous of these is Hadrian's Wall. On the left, you can see I have some representations of Hadrian's Wall. And as we look at it, we get an idea that the Romans went in very big for construction. What we're seeing is ruins. Initially, the wall itself was over 20 feet high and was wide enough in most places for the legionnaires to walk back and forth past each other. Over the years, some of the stones have been taken away to build roads, and it's been knocked down for a number of reasons, but we do have a very good idea as to its layout. As you can see from the map, Hadrian's Wall roughly ran the same boundary between England and Scotland as we have today. The modern boundaries between these two states would be roughly like this. The Antonine Wall, of course, is on here as well. It was not nearly as large. It was made out of wood, and it did not last nearly as long. Hadrian's Wall was much more effective. Other examples of Roman limes would include the various walls in Germany. Let's get some images for you here. As I mentioned, the Rhine and Danube formed the boundary of the Roman Empire. But the Rhine River, which comes down here, does not quite perfectly bisect, does not perfectly meet with the Danube River. So we have a space here that's not along the river. The space was fortified with various forts. If I get this larger, I would, and I cannot. But some of these ruins are available today. You can go see them. And here's another example, which is not large enough anyway, as to where they were actually at. Other limes were on other border areas, including over by Mesopotamia and Syria. But the Romans clearly liked walls. One of the reasons why I'm making a big deal about Hadrian's Wall, which is very famous because it's in Britain and Britain speaks English, as you all know, was that there became a fundamental change as far as the nature of defenses are concerned. The army becomes, as you can see right here, a garrison force. One of the things we admire about the Roman military system was the fact that it was so mobile. It was very good. They marched various places. They were very famous for being able to go over some pretty challenging obstacles. Well, when you have a wall, and that is the point of demarcation, the wall is actually more important than your ability to maneuver. Yes, you have to have men that are able to deploy rapidly at any critical point. But as far as marching in large numbers over long distances, this becomes something that the Romans are not as used to using at this point. We also have reason to believe that there were families at these walls. In fact, a child's booty was found at Hadrian's Wall, meaning that a child was living there. A letter has has been found, in which a woman is writing to a friend or relative, also indicating that there are women on the walls. We do have a reason to believe, therefore, that families were here. And you can imagine that would be something of interest to some of the men, because very often the men were in the legions for many years, sometimes 20 years. And who are you going to date? It's very hard to go back to Rome. It's very hard to go back to Italy, but there are the local girls. If you happen to be at Hadrian's Wall, you can look across the border and see all these fine young ladies who happen to be Picts. And if you happen to be in Germany, look across the border defenses and see all these nice young German girls. And after a while, you can hit up relationships, start dating. Pretty soon you might have a family. Over time, the garrison force actually did involve families, and something the occupation would be handed down from father to son. Over time, men have been stationed for very lengthy periods of time on the limes, would in fact become more familiar with the culture of the local people, which means they're a little bit less well, shall we say, enamored with Roman civilization itself. When these people start to relate more to local civilization, you can see that the Roman civilization itself would probably become a little bit less important to them. So there's a fundamental change now in the Roman Empire. Let's go back and talk about what's happening in Rome, what's happening in the various cities. And I put this essentially under the term of games. Gladiators, chariot races, those kinds of things were very common in the various places of the Roman Empire. We hear a lot about the gladiators. This makes for good copy. This makes for good stories. The men in the sand fighting for their lives. They are extremely important. However, as far as places that people went to enjoy the entertainment, there's probably far more people went to the chariot races than actually were at the arenas for the gladiatorial contests. The gladiators and the games were quite brutal, very brutal by our standards. There's no doubt that these people were, the Romans were a very brutal civilization. We have found in various places of the Roman Empire, I'm trying to remember the exact number, something like 104 arenas that existed in various places in the Roman Empire. Of course, the most famous ones were in Rome, but also we have a very strong indication that they were all over the place. We found them up in Switzerland, they've been found in France, and they're not as large as the ones in Rome because the population was less. But we do know this, that as far as the local population was concerned, many of these, in fact, would hold more population than the local community would support, which probably meant that people were coming from many miles away and various farms to see what's going on there. We have better records on what was happening in the arenas in Rome itself, the city itself. The various areas were not as sure. It's entirely possible the same kinds of things were going on in these various arenas that were going on in Rome. If that's the case, we can talk about some very brutal things in numerous places in the Roman Empire. And can we say the slaughter in both animals and human beings could have been major. Let's take a brief look at the gladiators. The gladiators were a professional group, most of whom were slaves, most of whom had been captured during military adventures, where they were trained to be extremely good at what they did. The gladiatorial contests were fighting till someone was either killed or disabled. Sometimes you'd have two men dueling out. Sometimes you'd have a number of men. Sometimes you'd actually have battles that were staged in some of these larger arenas, like the Colosseum of Rome, in which you had scores of men involved on both sides. Usually the games would start out early in the day, and probably starting out with animal shows, bring in various animals, of course, many of which were slaughtered. An interesting corollary to this is that some of the animals that were described in the records no longer exist. That means that they could have obviously have gone extinct, but maybe one of the factors in them going extinct was the fact that the Romans liked to see them killed, so they were hunted and brought in, and many of them, of course, were slaughtered. As the day progressed, it got more interesting. By the afternoon, sometimes late in the afternoons, then you'd have the gladiatorial contests. One of the reasons for this is that you build up to a climax. And on the other hand, gladiators were extremely expensive. It cost a lot of money to locate these men, to buy them, to train them. And the equipment, of course, wasn't cheap either. So you didn't want to have large numbers of men being killed at any given time, though that did happen on occasion. The whole idea was to put on a very good show. And there was real incentive for the men in combat to show their resilience, to show their strength, and to show their resourcefulness. If the contest went on a certain length of time, and one man is either injured or disabled, he's not yet dead, he could appeal, as you can see, I don't know how well you can see from this painting, he could appeal to the crowd. He'd hold up his hand, and usually using 3 fingers, the thumb and 2 fingers, he would hold up his hand and say, oh, obviously in a gesture, please spare my life. And if the crowd, and this could be involved thousands of people, if the crowd appealed to the man being saved, then they could give a gesture with the thumb. If the crowd did not think he fought well, or didn't want to see him survive, he really didn't want to miss the glory of watching a man die, then they would give another symbol. For many years, Roman historians were wondering if, let's see if I can get this so you can see it, that if this was life and this was death. I actually talked to a PhD, a man with a PhD in Roman history, and he told me about the theory. And to you and me, at least to me anyway, holding the thumb up to me would mean life, and holding the thumb down would, of course, be death. Well, there's a new theory. In the last few decades, a burial ground for gladiators was found in what we call modern-day Turkey, in the Anatolian Peninsula. And examining the remains, so examining the bones of these gladiators, another theory has come forward. You see, by the cuts on the bones, you get an idea of how actually these men were killed, and the manner which was done, the victor would take a sword, place it on the neck about right here, and shove it down in the chest cavity in that direction. In other words, this would cut the windpipe, this would cut the aorta, this would go into the heart or lungs, causing death in short order. So another theory about the Roman sign of wanting this man killed was not holding the thumb up or down, but actually going like this. This is how you want this to end. You want this man to die. Chariot races, as I've already mentioned, were even more popular. The reason why we know this is that the chariot racing arenas tended to be very, very large. A good example of that is the Circus Maximus, which happens to be in modern Rome. Well, it still exists in modern Rome. It was in Rome. It has never been excavated, but we have a very good idea as to what it looked like. The Circus Maximus was absolutely huge. It was about 4/5 of a mile around, which means if you have a chariot race, there's going to be quite a bit of drama in the long stretches on both sides. Of course, it took a lot of skill on the turning on the sides. We believe that maybe at the Colosseum, 40, 50, maybe even 60,000 people could have been in attendance. At the Circus Maximus, our estimates are closer to 200 or 250,000. If they were actually filling up this very large area, you could see that how popular these kind of things were. As in gladiatorial contests, there were no rules. There's no idea of fair play. There's no idea of being able to show mercy or being a good sport. No, any way you win is perfectly acceptable. In the famous novel written by a Civil War general was Lew Wallace, the novel is called Ben-Hur. It's been about 3 movie versions that I'm aware of in which the novel has been reenacted for the screen. In the 1959 version, I believe, that was the one with Charlton Heston, they have an interesting statement. Remember, Ben-Hur would like to have revenge for what he believes is the death of his mother and his sister. And when the man who owns the horses says, oh, by the way, there are no rules in the arenas. In the circus, many are killed. And that piques Charlton Heston's interest, and he's going to go out and seek revenge against his enemy. The Colosseum, most famous arena of them all. In ancient Rome, I have the dates of the construction. We built 70 to 80 AD, using the techniques that they had available to the Romans at that time. This is pretty rapid construction. Now, notice the dates. This is 70 to 80 AD. There was a Jewish revolt in Palestine from the year 66 to 70 AD. And of course, the survivors, the Jews, were captured and were enslaved. We think many of them, thousands of them, were brought to Rome, and it was their physical labor that actually constructed the Colosseum. As you can see, it survives in a very large, the ruin is not that bad. I have been there. I was surprised how big it was. What we're seeing is a stone exterior. So I can get a better view for you here. Internally, the seating was probably on wood. That hasn't survived. That's why we think the structure, you place wood benches all the way around this, that it could hold a very large number of people. On the interior, and I'd like to show you an interior shot if I can. On the interior, I don't see one right here, there were a number of, when I was there was a number of Christian crosses. The idea was that many Christians, we know this, that many Christians were in fact murdered, were sacrificed, were martyred, if you will, in the Colosseum. Modern historians have said that is correct. There's every reason to believe that they were, get the interior, that this is what happened. But some historians have said that it'd probably be, give you an idea of what it looks like on the inside, that it might be better even to have monuments over at the Circus Maximus, because we know that more Christians were in fact murdered there than was the case at the Colosseum. You can see the seating would have been up here, the floor would have been here. The floor was actually made out of wood. Of course, sand was placed on it to sop up the blood. But there is a structure underneath the bottom of this where animals and other combatants could be raised or lowered. This was apparently watertight. There were times when they actually flooded this area, and they throw out young maidens, young attractive women, and then turn on the alligators or hippopotami to come out and kill and eat them to the delight of the crowd. It is true, we believe, that in fact a lot of people were killed by animals, but there is no animal actually that eats human beings as part of their regular diet. In fact, usually animals are quite afraid of human beings. This includes some of the more vicious animals, including lions and bears. They do not eat human beings. Well, you'd have to get a special animal. You have to get the animal very hungry, virtually starving. You'd also have to have human beings that were usually tied up, because if they were running around, it might scare the animals too much. And then they would smear blood of a deer or gazelle or something on the human beings, so the animals would not be smelling the people. But having made these kind of adjustments, we believe very strongly that they were actually killing and eating human beings there. At the stadiums, we find that there were various cheering groups, and they identified themselves by the use of color. As you can see, red, white, blue, and green. These are the various cheering groups. The people who went to the Circus Maximus, the other circuses, the people that went to the Coliseum, the other arenas, they would come and sit in a certain section. You would identify yourself by color. We do the same thing to a certain extent. I'm sure many of you have gone to high school or college football games, and you see that certain sections are wearing certain colors. I'm aware that University of Utah has a color red, but sometimes they have the black night. And you come, everybody wears black that night, and everybody who wears red. Now, obviously, BYU's color is blue. If you've ever gone to a BYU University of Utah game, you know who's rooting for whom by the colors that they wear. So we do the same things, but it's not really quite as vicious. It was very dangerous if you were green, for example, to be in a white area. If you're wearing the wrong colors at the wrong time, that could be very damaging. They might beat you up, and quite frankly, they might kill you. These were cheering groups, but also when they went home, you were a blue, you went to a blue neighborhood. You didn't go to a white neighborhood. Going to a white neighborhood, once again, is very dangerous. The Reds would go to a red neighborhood. These were not just rooting sessions, but these were living sections of the city itself. We can say they're gangs. There are times, I'm sure you're aware, in West Valley City and other cities in the United States, if you're wearing the wrong color in the wrong neighborhood, that can be very dangerous. In fact, there's people who have been shot and killed because of these kinds of things. Why would this be important to the ancient Romans? The police force in Rome was very weak, and some people say it was virtually non-existent. In other words, you have in areas of high crime, how do you protect yourself? The reds, the whites, the blues, and the greens could actually be something like a neighborhood protection group. That if you're there, they know who you are, you're wearing the right color, they know you're not a thief, you're not going to bother anybody, you're not going to beat anybody up. But if you come in wearing the wrong color, then obviously you cannot be trusted, you might be a thief. And this is a way of having a neighborhood in which you protect each other. So these things existed for many centuries. In fact, after the collapse of the Roman Empire, in the West, there was a vestige in the Eastern Empire. We call it the Byzantines. And the Byzantines actually had cheering groups and neighborhoods also designated by color. We can speculate, we can ask ourselves a question. Why is it, or why was it, that the Romans were so brutal? Why on earth do you have a society that gets joy out of watching so much pain? This is a very hard question to answer. To get a very good idea, you probably have to talk to a psychology professor, a sociology professor. I'm going to hazard a little bit of a guess, however, that really why people end up bad or like vicious things is yet to be fully explained. But let me throw this out for your consideration. There is a tendency for people who have been abused, children have been abused, to be less caring, less feeling. Children abused, quite frankly, tend to be abusive themselves. It's been argued by some sociologists that abuse never did anybody any good, which is probably true, and can lead to a lot of problems. As they say, people that were treated with cruelty will be cruel. Does this mean somehow that the Roman system was cruel? I believe it was as far as the slaves were concerned. And even though slaves really didn't have the opportunity to enjoy what was happening in the arenas, men who had been freed later in life, essentially been worked to the point where they're no longer economic assets, had in fact been released, and some of them drifted into Rome, the city, and were able to sit in the highest, they were freed, able to sit in the highest levels of the arenas and be able to look down and see what's going on. Are they sadistically trying to think in terms somehow they get some pleasure out of this? We know that it was common to abuse Roman children, particularly Roman boys when they went to school. We have accounts of these boys being taught grammar, being taught advanced studies by the use of the whip. We have an autobiography from St. Augustine, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. St. Augustine said that when he was in school that he was whipped as well. So we have primary sources that indicate this. However, being beaten at school does not prove that this is the reason for a very large, brutal society. More likely, if this is a good theory, that these people, these children, were severely brutalized in other contexts, in home as well. One of the aspects of Roman civilization, which we admire a great deal, is Roman law. Roman law comes down to us in various manners, one of which is that the church, the Catholic Church later on, accepted some of the aspects of Roman law as church law. So it comes to us in that direction. The Byzantines, which I've already mentioned, codified some of the laws. So we have some of the legal groups that survived and were able to be around later when the Renaissance, back in starting the 14th and 15th centuries in Europe, started to look at the Roman experience with a great deal of admiration. So they were able to use the law to their advantage. So Roman law influences us even today. Now, I want to clarify one issue. The United States is not under Roman law. We are under what we call English common law. Britain has a different experience, but almost all of the rest of Europe, France, Germany, Italy, owe their basic law back to Roman law. So why is Roman law important? It's good law. It's codified law. It covers many bases, and it does for you what many of the upper classes like. Roman law is often viewed very heavily, and shall we say, involved very heavily with property rights. See, I have that right here. Has property rights. Property rights means, of course, you control things. You control land. You control people as well, because people are property, particularly if they are slaves. Can we say the law is very good for the upper classes? One of the reasons why it survives so long is the upper class says, wow, this gives us certain advantages. There's no doubt about that at all. There is a term in Latin called quisidio. It's a euphemism for torture. Technically, a good translation would probably be putting the question, but it really means torture. In some cases in the Roman legal system, a deposition taken from a slave or lower class person was inadmissible in court unless it was taken under torture. Now, you can imagine what kind of information you get if something's taken under torture. If you're being tortured, the most important thing in your mind is that the torment stops, which means that you'll say, or in some cases do, anything they want you to say or do to get it to stop. Therefore, information can be compromised, it can be unreliable. And this does represent a problem. However, in using quisidio, using torture, this is another mechanism by which the upper classes can control or intimidate the lower classes. In the English common law system, which you and I are familiar with, the person who decides, or the persons I should say, who decide on the guilt or innocence of an accused party are what we used to call 12 good men and true, in other words, the jury system. Difficulty with the jury system is nowadays is that now you have to include women as well, which I think is a very good idea. But 12 people from society, supposed to be roughly your socioeconomic group, will decide on your guilt or innocence. In our system, the judge is virtually impartial referee. He or she nowadays literally keeps the two sides from duking it out. In the Roman legal system, the judge has a different function. In the Roman legal system, the judge is actively engaged in finding the truth. Usually as one judge, there are times there's 3 or even 5 judges. The reason for the odd number is obvious. You can never have a tie. So an odd number means that one side or the other will win. It does not have to be unanimous like in our system. Can we say, in comparing the two systems, It is harder to intimidate or bribe 12 men than in the Roman system where you only have to get to 1 or 3. So our system has more guidelines to protect it against fraud and difficulties. The Roman legal system is more easily controlled, usually by the upper classes. An example of Roman law is actually within the social realm. We call this man the pater familias, in other words, the father of the family, the oldest male. And he controls the family. He can keep his daughters from marrying. He can control his sons until they become of an adult age, which was usually age 25. He could divorce his wife by whatever reason. Doesn't have to have a good reason. I just don't like you anymore, whatever, and throw them out. Can we say to a certain extent, therefore, Roman law and the familial law, or the law of the family, are similar in that you have a power structure which largely is on top. The Romans were extremely good in construction. One of the things we remember them for is really very advanced construction. As we look at the Roman Empire, we measure maybe 250,000 miles of roads. And most of these would be dirt roads or tracks. But about 50,000 miles were in fact paved with stone. These are such durable roads that some of them are in use for over 1,000 years, well into the Middle Ages. I was talking to a gentleman who went on a bus tour in Italy years ago, and he said that some of the buses are actually going down Roman roads. They're still actually being used. Now, the difficulty occurred to him is this, that as you can see, many of these things are laid out by stones. Sometimes we call these cobblestones. And taking a bus over that at certain speeds is going to jiggle you quite a bit. But they were very well constructed, going down several feet to lay the roadbed. As you can see from this example, which I'm indicating, you can see the track here and here of Roman chariots, which probably meant that this was in use for many years, probably even hundreds of years. This is actually true in other places as well. The Romans had, this is probably in Pompeii, if you look down some of these streets in Pompeii, I have visited there, you will see that sometimes they have ruts for the chariots or carts to go through. You have a stone here, here, and here, so the pedestrians could step over them. The reason for that was that there could be all kinds of donkey poop and horse poop on the pavement. You don't want to walk through that mess. It'd be very easy to take the stones, as you can see, and walk across them. When the Romans were building the roads, they were largely built early on when the Roman legions were conquering areas. You want to have good roads for good communication. The better roads you have, the better you are to be able to move goods and services and troops and their supplies to wherever you want to be. Let's say you're building a road from across Gaul. You and I would call it France, of course. And what the Romans would do, they would simply start out on a point, and they want to go roughly north, let's say. And you look out in north, and you would look at the highest point. And you go from like hilltop to hilltop to hilltop. In places like France, that's not terribly difficult. Most of France is a rolling country, so you do see hills very easily. One of the reasons why you go from hill to hill was because that if you go in low-lying areas, and you run the risk of marshes, and if you have a lot of rains, it can be quite muddy. So hill to hill keeps it drier and allows the roads to function a lot better. The Romans are also very good in building bridges. They build an awful lot of bridges. It was said that during the height of the Roman Empire, you could literally start in Rome, and you could follow a road all the way to the English Channel without ever once putting your sandal in water, because you had bridges and roads on high areas. Once you got across the channel, then you could probably go almost all the way to the border, to Hadrian's Wall, with the same situation. You would not have to put your foot in water. The problem, of course, was in the English Channel. You had to take a boat across. I don't remember the year when the channel was completed, but that has been a problem until recent decades, where even yet you could not get across the English Channel easily. The Roman roads are economic and political necessity, and they're very, very good networks. Aqueducts were something of exceptional skill that the Romans used. Let's pull up a few aqueducts for your viewing pleasure here. The Romans liked water. They're very good in use of water. Give you a few images here. Some of these have been in operation for well over 1,000 years, 1,500 years or even more. Some are getting close to 2,000 years. This is one of the most famous ones. This is in Nîmes, France. I have not seen it. I'd like to show you one of these with a human figure in them to give you an idea of perspective. Human figures are probably too small to show up. But this is something that's very, very large indeed. Now, the idea of aqueducts, obviously, is to carry water. And you want to carry water across a stream, in this case, a river. You might ask the logical question, why not just bring the water from the river up to where you want it to be? The difficulty with that is that Romans do not have any kind of a pump. So they can't pump the water up here. It's inefficient to use a bucket brigade to bring it up. So you'd find a stream. Sometimes the stream was many miles away from the city or place where you wanted the water. Sometimes the aqueduct streams were not that wide, just like the width of a chariot, and sometimes just a foot or two deep. In order to have water flowing for many miles, you have to have a perfect gradient. If it's too steep, then the water just slops out. If it's too shallow, then the water simply does not flow. The gradient is a very small, it has to be completely uniform over many miles. And the Romans were absolute experts at doing this. Let's give you an idea, if I can show you aqueducts in actual Rome itself. Rome, of course, as I've already mentioned, had a very large population. Depending on which book you want to read, it could have been in the, certainly in the hundreds of thousands. One book I read said it could have been in the millions. Okay. The number of aqueducts that supplied Rome was quite large. Some of them came from various directions, obviously. They came from the hills where the springs were located. And they also sometimes went around curves. I don't see exactly what I'm looking for, but you do get an idea as to the size, the complexity, and the literal brilliance of these things. Aesthetically, let's take a look at them. In reality, would you agree with me, or would you just humor me in saying that these things are very, very attractive? They're quite beautiful. The arches are stunning, large arches and smaller arches. Later on in the early Middle Ages, we have a form of art called the Romanesque. We'll mention this in a different context later on. But the Romanesque had the interior of the building. This is the nave. This is the central aisleway in the cathedral itself, these Romanesque churches. And they would actually also have this kind of vaulting. You would have arch on arch and a smaller arch on top. One of the reasons, of course, why the builders of the Romanesque churches would do this is because they thought it was so beautiful. Well, I agree with that, but these are actually beautiful as well. And it is likely, it's possible anyway, that in reality, the architects for Romanesque architecture were using the aqueduct as a model. One of the most beautiful buildings that's ever been constructed is a magnificent dome structure in the city of Rome. It's called the Pantheon, which means it's dedicated to all the gods. So I can get some other representation of the Pantheon. Okay, we have the exterior views here. As you can see by looking at the exterior, this looks very much like a Greek temple. That's probably the inspiration for the architecture. You have a very nice Greek temple out here. The dome is behind, this is the entrance, of course. The dome is actually behind here. The Romans were extremely good at building domes. They excelled. Remember, they got the arch from the Etruscans. To have a dome, all you have to have is an arch on an arch on an arch, going around a circle, and now you have a dome. The Romans had an advantage in building because they had an advanced concrete, which I don't think I have on your study guide. They had such good concrete that in fact they could pour it into water and it would set up underwater. We believe the Greeks had a kind of concrete, but it would take like a year for it to set up. For most building projects, that's impractical. What we have on the interior of the Pantheon is the use of concrete construction. That would go up thinner and thinner until you get to the oculus or eye. When you have structures made out of stone, we have, let's get an arch. If I could type correctly, I would be a little bit faster. So if you have an arch, and very often you have a keystone, and can I give you an example of a keystone here? The keystone is actually the top stone about right here. Let's give you a better example. See, this would be the keystone right here. The structure is unstable. In fact, it will collapse until it's virtually complete. When you have it complete and you put the keystone on top, then the weight of the entire structure actually follows down from here into both sides of the arch, down into the walls, so the weight is carried directly into the ground. If you don't have that, the weight of the various stones will simply collapse. Now, as we look at the Pantheon, one of the remarkable aspects is that if this was made out of stone, you would come up here, you'd have to have a keystone, or the entire thing would collapse. Where the keystone should be, we have the oculus, we have the eye, we have this hole in the roof which allows light to come in so the place will not be nearly as dark. It doesn't rain a lot in Italy, but it does rain. So on a rainy day, you're going to have water come in, you splash around on the floor a little bit. And drainage systems can take that off, so it's not much of a problem. It would take remarkable skill to build a building like this without the use of this keystone in the middle. In other words, the weight would have to come in such a manner that you would not have to have the keystone, that the weight would actually go around the edge or the circumference of the oculus and be able to hold the structure up that way. Remember, this is over 1,800 years old. It's extremely remarkably skilled that they could do this. Another remarkable aspect of the building itself is that concrete's heavy. You can call it liquid stone, but even stone is heavy. So, and you're building this out of the concrete. The exterior is going to have to be quite thick, but as you go up with heavy concrete, you're going to have a problem in supporting this. In fact, the entire thing could come crashing down unless you can find a way of having strength without weight. We believe what the Romans did is they would take pottery and get small, see if I can show you here a little bit, maybe so big, and they would have little pots, and of course they would fire them in a kiln so they're virtually as strong as a brick. and you put a large number of these within the concrete of the building. This is very strong, but it's also very light. So you could have heavy concrete being supported up here without having the entire thing collapse. We can say that this is probably the most magnificent dome structure ever completed until we get to Hagia Sophia several centuries in the Byzantine Empire. And we'll mention that when we talk about medieval art. Let's go down here. We need to go to page number 10. We talked about the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. We talked about how extensive it was. We talked about how much was accomplished that time frame. But Rome runs into problems. And I'm going to put this under the rubric of the crisis of the 3rd century. These are the 200s. Remember, the Pax Romana, we usually say, ends at about the year 180. That was the year Marcus Aurelius died. And rather than going to the most able man to rule Rome after him, Marcus Aurelius, who was a very able man, gave control of the empire to his son Commodus. Commodus was a piece of junk. I don't know how else to describe him. At times he had delusions. He thought he was Hercules. He actually went into the arenas to fight. Of course, he had to make sure that nobody is going to hurt him. So the matches were rigged. It'd be a little bit like if the Holy Father, the Pope in Rome, started going down to wrestling in WWF. It was beneath the dignity of the office. Commodus had men brought in there who had lost their legs, who had difficulty in even walking, and he had the opportunity of slaughtering them. He had, if we can believe our sources, something like 500 men for his physical enjoyment, 500 women. At one time, he could be seen walking in Rome, carrying a stone. He's walking backwards. This man wasn't even in control of his own faculties, let alone he didn't really have the ability to rule Rome well. Starting with him, we see a decline. We see a decline in organization. We see a decline in the government. And he gets even more severe. There were people, men who were assigned to protect the emperor. This is the Praetorian Guard. This is the bodyguard of the emperor. Now we have, I think it's called the Secret Service, we have men who have actually sworn that they'll allow themselves to be killed in the protection of the President of the United States. Then, however, during the Roman Empire, we have the Praetorian Guard becoming a loose cannon. By that I mean, very often, rather than protecting the emperor, they in fact killed him. This is a terribly unstable scenario to really have. Why would the Praetorian Guard turn on the emperor? Well, you get a bribe from somebody else. There are other political factions that really would like to overthrow the emperor. And this system led to almost chaos. So the Praetorian Guard makes and breaks emperors. The barracks emperors. As you can see from the period, was at 49 years, there were 20 emperors in that period of time. In the chaotic year of 238 AD alone, we see 6 different men claiming to be emperor. This is nuts. This is unstable. Not only is the Praetorian Guard making and breaking emperors, but we find that the army is involved in this as well. Most of these men, remember, barracks emperors does imply that these were men of a military background, which is clearly the case. These men were generals, and they, of course, they had to be very ambitious, and also, shall we say, from our perspective, they bordered on being very foolish, for the simple reason that they could simply be killed. And their life expectancy, as you can well see, it was not very good. But anyway, you get an ambitious general, and he appeals to the army. I will give you bribes, in other words, I'll pay you better if you will fight for me and you'll conquer and beat the other emperors. Rather than having these people who are properly guarding the boundaries of the Roman Empire, the legions are often recalled to fight each other. Sometimes the boundaries, the limes, were poorly defended, sometimes not defended at all, which allowed peoples outside the Roman Empire to gain access to the empire itself. There are new Germanic people that showed up. We first read about them about 258 AD. The Germanic tribes came from Eastern Europe. In fact, the Greeks, the Romans, came from virtually the same areas, but much earlier time frame. Can we say this is the latest wave during the Roman Empire of people on the move and moving toward Rome? One of the reasons why they do this is obviously life is better in Rome, better agriculture, you eat better. You can pillage and plunder, you get more jewelry, you get more gold. And the first time that the Goths invade is in 258 AD. The Romans are resourceful. They fight them. My goodness, there are times when they say they've virtually gone in, found the Gothic camps, slaughtered large percentages of men, saying, well, in this case, we have a pretty good indication that the Goths are weakened. Well, they were weakened, but give them 10 years until the young men grow up again. Give them 20 years until the little boys grow up. And now you got this severe problem all over again. The Goths were never solved. In fact, the Goths got so large that there was the Ostrogoths, the East Goths, and the Visigoths, the West Goths. In other words, they broke into two large groups of Germanic tribes. And these were never destroyed. In fact, quite frankly, it was the Goths, among other groups, that invaded and finally brought down the Roman Empire. The era of Beric's emperors actually came to an end under the reign of Diocletian. Can we say Diocletian was the last of the Beric's emperors? It's tempting to say he was the last man standing after the civil wars and all the other armies have been virtually fought to a standstill, that it was Diocletian who was able to finally bring order. Had he done that, had he just ended the civil wars, we remember him for this remarkable accomplishment. But he's famous for a lot of other things as well. Notice he rules, those nice birth and death dates, from about 284 AD to 305. That's over 20 years. That's long enough to make your mark. And Constantine, which we'll mention in a little while, essentially took over after Diocletian, and he rules, as you can see, for another 30 years. But let's take a look at what Diocletian did and something also of what Constantine did. How do you fix the problems? One of the problems in the Roman Empire, with all these civil wars, is a severe decline in the Roman economy. If you want an expanding economy, you should have enough money, in this case coins, silver coins primarily, that are in circulation to support the economy. Well, over time, Rome needs more coinage, but they don't have enough silver. You can get it by conquest, but there are virtually very small amounts of silver that's available to be mined in the Roman Empire. Inflation strikes when the coinage becomes devalued. Originally, about the time of Augustus, a Roman coin would be about as pure amount of about as pure amount of silver as you could possibly have. But over time, you add a little bit of copper to it. Rather than being a silver, they start to look a little bit darker. And yeah, you get more coinage that way, particularly if you're paying Roman legions and they say, we want more money. Well, I don't have enough silver to pay you. Let's put a little copper with the silver and you can do a pretty good job. The difficulty with this is that over time, inflation starts eating them up. And the coinage becomes devalued to the point where you have to have larger coins and more coins to buy something. Can we say by the time that Diocletian took over, as you can see in about 284 AD, that the coinage, was, rather than being almost all silver, had very small silver content at all. In fact, it was almost entirely copper. Copper is not nearly as valuable as silver, so you had to have a lot more coins and a lot bigger coins to purchase, to make the same purchases. We can believe that it became so cumbersome that at times the economy has to function under barter. Rather than using coins to pay for whatever you need, in fact, what you are doing is using trading chickens for pigs, or a pair of shoes for a brick, something like that. That's a very inefficient way to run the economy. Diocletian realizes this. He's got to figure out a way to make this work. So how are you going to get more silver? Well, he tries to find more silver. He gets more silver from plunder. He never is successful in bringing Roman coinage back to the point where it was before the time of the Civil Wars. Can we say, however, he puts a lot more silver into the coins? And because of this, they become more intrinsically valuable. Because of the value, they become a better means of exchange than had been going on before. There are other problems which he attempts to resolve. And he decides to divide the empire, I said that wrong, empire for protection. Let's get division. I could read what I was doing here. I need to wear glasses. Okay. Diocletian is quite concerned over the ability of Rome to defend itself. You see, we have problems up here on the borders. The Goths are largely along here. Other Germanic groups, the Suevi, the Franks, the Alemanni are up in these areas as well. If you are trying to organize your defense from Rome, Rome is not necessarily the best place to do this because Rome is far away from the borders. It's very good for controlling the Mediterranean, but not nearly as good in controlling, let's get this one up here, as in controlling potential problems. This is hundreds of miles. If you have a problem up here and you have to go to Rome for them to make a decision, for them to deploy forces, this is cumbersome. How about have somebody who's local, somebody who lives nearby, somebody who can take Roman legions and react quite rapidly? Very, very important. So in order to get strength, Diocletian tries to find strength in division. You can see basically 4 dividing areas: Italy, Spain, France, Britain, Balkans, a divided Greece, and very importantly, the Anatolian Peninsula and down into Egypt. The idea here was this: there'd be 4 men rule. There would be an Augustus here and an Augustus here. The secondary man would be a Caesar. The Augustus would control one of these, but then he would be responsible for overseeing what's happening here. The Caesar would be the secondary man in both cases. You have the Augustus here and the Caesar here. This does make sense on paper, but in reality, when the Romans are not loyal to each other, loyal to the state, they become loyal to the emperor, in this case the emperor, the Augustus, or the Caesar, that you can find problems with civil wars. As long as Diocletian and later Constantine is on top of this, this does function. However, when they're no longer available, no longer around, you do have other problems with civil wars because we have Caesars fighting Augustuses and those kind of problems to dominate the Roman Empire. One thing I should have mentioned about the loyalty of the Roman legions is that the generals were paying the legionnaires. And if somebody pays you, That's to whom you owe your loyalty. One of the reasons why people aren't fighting for Rome, they're fighting for their general, is because that's where the pay comes from. One of the reasons why I'm making a deal over this, and it is kind of a curious thing which they're doing, but in reality, we forget about the divisions in the East, the two divisions in the East and that in the West. What we do remember very well indeed is the one that divided East from West. Because when we talk about the fall of Rome, we talk about the collapse of the Roman system, we are talking about this area. It falls in the West. The East, which we later call the Byzantine Empire, it shrinks, it takes a long time, but in reality, it survives, at least in some vestiges, for the next 1,000 years. It does not entirely collapse until the 15th century AD. So this is one of the reasons why I'm making a deal over this. Another factor, let's go over here, is divide empire for protection, but compulsion and rigidity. One of the problems during the Civil War are people who need protection. And the way they have protection is that a lot of times they will run into the cities. Before this time frame, you don't hear much about the Roman cities having walls, but now walls are built almost everywhere. You need this for protection. Somebody's going to come in with their army. When you run into a city, or sometimes large estates, we call them latifundia, where the local peasants, the farmers, will run into a fortified place for protection. In reality, we do find people that are leaving their occupations. Yeah, we still have a lot of farmers because we have to have a lot of them to eat. But too many people are turning to other occupations, at least according to Diocletian. So he tries to strengthen the empire by compulsion and rigidity. If your father was a carpenter, you're a carpenter. If your father was a blacksmith, you're a blacksmith. If your father was a brickmason, you're a brickmason. If your father was a farmer, you're a farmer. You see, this stifles creativity, it stifles social mobility. But can we say this is at least one factor in which Diocletian tries to stabilize the society and the economy of Rome? This is worth mentioning as a factor perhaps in the decline of Rome, but we can also mention this as a factor we see in the Middle Ages. We think about the Middle Ages, which is largely true, but not entirely, of people living in fortified villages, latifundia, which we're later going to call the fief, in fortified cities. But yes, these are obvious factors in Roman, and should say medieval civilization. But in some respects, quite frankly, many respects, we do not find this being created during the Middle Ages. In fact, these people were created before this, and it was something that was placed into operation, or shall I say, continued operation during the Middle Ages. Well, I have a lot more to say about Rome, but I also want to talk about perhaps the most important Roman institution, ancient institution, that survives into the Middle Ages, and that's the Christian church. Christianity was more literate than a lot of other groups of people at the fall of the Roman Empire. They carried on more administrative traditions. They, as I've already mentioned, they tend to keep Roman law, at least in some aspects, viable and working. And intellectually and artistically, literarily, the church is a conduit by which we take Roman civilization into the Middle Ages. And of course, the Middle Ages eventually evolves into the modern world. So Christianity is extremely important. Let's take a few comments about early Christianity. I know you've been a good boy and girl. You go to your pastor, you go to your reverend, and your spiritual leader has given you a very good introduction into the spiritual nature of early Christianity. I'm not going to repeat that, but I would like to give you just a basic idea as to some of the important aspects of early Christianity that's going to allow it to be a conduit, if you will, of passing on Roman ideas into the Middle Ages. So let's take a look at early Christianity. The founder of Christianity obviously is Jesus of Nazareth. He's often known as Jesus Christ. Some people object to the term Jesus Christ. I think Christ means the anointed one, because people say that's a theological statement. Well, maybe it is. However, if I refer to Jesus as Jesus Christ, I'm not trying to make a theological statement. Your belief system is up to you, and it's whatever you believe is fine with me. I'm sure you're aware that I'm also using conventional dates. I'm using BC rather than BCE. I'm using AD rather than ACE, after the Common Era. Some people object because Anno Domini means in the year of our Lord. Some people say that we shouldn't use that because you're making a value judgment, you're making a religious statement, so we should use the Common Era. I'm not trying to make a theological statement, but I'm old school. I used AD, I'm going to continue using AD. Hopefully you'll forgive me for that. Well, Jesus of Nazareth. How influential was he in his lifetime? Well, not very. His following was very, very small initially. But in the long run, after his death, the teachings, the ideas of Jesus become absolutely enormous. There are people that don't like him, and there are people that think he's absolutely divine. Once again, I'm not commenting on that. However, one thing we can be completely sure of, and even his most ardent critics have a tendency to say, this man was a master teacher. I think that's quite clear. He uses parables. In fact, we read in Mark chapter 4, verse 34, he did not say anything unto them without a parable. A parable is a story for a principle or moral lesson. I could sit here right now and say, oh, remember the parable of the Good Samaritan. And each one of you who's had a Christian background would know the entire story in your mind. I could also say, how about the parable of the sowers in the field? How about the parable of the talents, the gold coins? How about the parable of the prodigal son? See, all these things would come to mind because stories have a tendency to be very easily remembered. I do very strongly believe that if you want somebody to remember something, tell a story. And so can we say some of the best stories are ones we tell about ourselves? But, I mean, you've heard me squawk up here for many months now. And the kinds of things that people remember what I say is when I'm telling a story. Jesus was a master at this. To whom does he send his message? It's important to realize this. While the religion later on becomes a religion of kings, becomes a religion of upper class people, can we say even virtually everybody in society, initially, Jesus' message is directed at the poor and the socially weak. These are people that are sometimes left out of the system. I mean, in the parable of Lazarus, Lazarus is a guy, life goes poorly for him. Everything turns out wrong. He's got sores on his bodies. The dogs even come and lick his sores. And the rich man comes by. And the Bible doesn't say, oh, the rich man was a bad man. It just says rich. He might have been a bad man. But in any event, Jesus says both men die. And the rich man goes to a place which is not pleasant. And the poor man, Lazarus, goes to the bosom of Abraham. Okay. Is that making some kind of social statement? I think it is. And this is the kind of thing that Jesus likes to do. He talks about a message going to the socially weak. Can we say Jesus is very controversial? Yes. I mean, how many different Christian religions and groups are there? I don't know. Scores. The last time I looked this up in an almanac, they were talking about 20 major Christian religious groups, and this in the United States alone, and each of those would number in the hundreds of thousands. Of course, there'd be smaller groups. If everybody was in agreement on Jesus, his teachings, and his importance, then we'd probably have a smaller group, or perhaps even only one group at all. Since we have so many groups, almost everybody wants Jesus to reflect their ideas, and they have a tendency to interpret his life and his teachings in that manner. I remember many years ago, back when I was in college, there were some fundamentalist Christians who thought that we ought to be living lives like Jesus lived. Well, we know that the Israelites, the Jews, the time of Jesus, were not wearing trousers. They were wearing, well, robes. We can call them dresses if we like. Was Jesus clean shaven? Well, probably not. He probably had a beard. He probably had long hair. So some people thought that it's a pretty good idea to grow your hair long and to wear a robe, to wear a skirt. That's how you follow Jesus. And Jesus didn't have a job, at least not as far as we know. At least during his ministry, he had no job. So let's not have a job either. We see in which direction, how far these things can go. Some people say that's a very good idea. Some people say, well, that's a little extreme. But he is controversial. Depending on how we interpret Jesus, the length of Jesus' ministry, it can be from 1 to 3 years. Traditionally, it's usually 3 years. The reason why we know that as we read the Gospels, the various accounts of his life, is that we read about Passover, various festivals being repeated how many times. Passover, for example, is mentioned 3 times. So people say, well, 3 years. And that's probably our best indication of how long he actually preached. Well, we hear accounts of him dying. He lives again. He's resurrected. And he comes back. We have a very brief account in the book of Acts about the last time when Jesus was among his disciples. Some of these men are called apostles. So 40 days after Easter, in Acts 1 and 9, we read, he was taken up before their very eyes, and a cloud hid him from their sight. Jesus is gone. He doesn't come back. This is often called Pentecost. We say the early centuries of Christianity, roughly 300 years, is from Pentecost, Jesus ascended to heaven, until about 313 AD, and when Constantine offers the church official patronage and toleration. We'll come back and talk about that later. Can we say this time frame the religious spreads? No doubt about that. And we have, at this time, conflict with the pagans as well. Well, I'm just getting into this, but we're out of time. So I'm going to give you a break, and I will come back and start again at this point later on, and we can look forward to that as being the second lecture. In the meantime, I appreciate you sticking with this. Hopefully this has worked out fairly well, and I will record the second lecture and make it available right away. Until then, enjoy.